My beloved child, don't skip this message. Stay until the very end because today's story may touch your heart in a way you never expected. Something beautiful has been unfolding quietly, hidden behind ordinary days and silent prayers. While you believed nothing was changing, someone else's heart was experiencing a transformation so deep that they could no longer hide it. What happened next changed everything. Listen carefully, because this story is about the power of forgiveness, hope, and the quiet ways love can grow when hearts are willing to change. For what felt like forever, your soulmate carried emotions they could barely understand. They smiled in front of others, fulfilled their responsibilities, and appeared to move forward with life. Yet every quiet evening, when the noise of the day faded away, they found themselves reflecting on the people and moments that had shaped them. They often wondered whether old misunderstandings could ever be healed, whether missed opportunities could ever become new beginnings, and whether the lessons learned through waiting had prepared them for something greater. These thoughts didn't disappear overnight. Instead, they slowly led them toward a deeper sense of gratitude and faith. Don't skip this moment. At the same time, your own journey had been changing you in ways you didn't always notice. You had learned patience through seasons that tested your endurance. You had discovered compassion through your own struggles. You had become more willing to forgive, more willing to grow, and more willing to place your future in God's hands instead of trying to control every outcome. Those changes were quiet. There were no dramatic announcements or extraordinary signs. But day after day, your character was being shaped into someone stronger, wiser, and more gracious. Meanwhile, your soulmate began noticing those changes, not through some mystical revelation, but through ordinary conversations, shared memories, and the way you carried yourself. They realized you no longer reacted to difficulties with the same fear you once carried. They noticed a new calmness in your words, a new kindness in your actions, and a quiet confidence rooted in faith rather than certainty. Every observation reminded them that growth often happens slowly, becoming visible only when we look back. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. One evening, your soulmate sat alone with an old journal they had nearly forgotten. As they turned each page, they found entries written during difficult seasons, prayers asking for wisdom, strength, and healing. Some pages reflected disappointment. Others expressed hope. As they continued reading, tears filled their eyes. They realized that many of the qualities they had once prayed for had quietly become part of their life. They had asked for patience, and waiting had taught them patience. They had asked for courage, and difficult choices had strengthened their courage. They had asked for genuine love, and God had first taught them how to love with humility. Don't skip this part. That night, your soulmate whispered a simple prayer unlike any they had prayed before. Lord, thank you for changing my heart before changing my circumstances. Thank you for teaching me that healing often begins within us long before we see it around us. Help me continue walking with honesty, compassion, and faith, no matter what tomorrow brings. As those words left their lips, a deep sense of peace settled over them. For the first time in years, they felt free from the burden of regret. The following morning, something happened that caught them completely by surprise. They heard encouraging news about the positive changes taking place in your life. They learned about the kindness you had shown others, the forgiveness you had chosen, and the strength you had displayed during challenging times. Hearing those stories deeply moved them. It wasn't because you had become perfect. It was because you had continued growing despite life's hardships. In that moment, they realized that true transformation isn't measured by flawless living but by a heart willing to keep learning and trusting God. Their emotions became impossible to hide. Tears began streaming down their face, not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude. They thanked God for reminding them that people can change, relationships can heal, and hope can return even after seasons of uncertainty. Those tears represented release. They carried away old fears, old regrets, and old assumptions, making room for something far healthier and more enduring. Listen carefully. The reason your soulmate was crying with happiness wasn't because of one dramatic event. It was because they recognized that both of you had grown in ways neither of you could have imagined. They saw that healing had quietly replaced bitterness, patience had replaced frustration, and faith had become stronger than fear. They realized that the greatest miracle was not a sudden change in circumstances, it was the quiet transformation of two hearts learning to reflect God's love more faithfully. As evening approached, your soulmate looked toward the setting sun and smiled through grateful tears. They whispered, "Lord, thank you for reminding me that your timing is never wasted. Thank you for every lesson that prepared us for this season. Continue leading us one faithful step at a time." At that moment, they understood that the most beautiful stories are not written in a single extraordinary day. They are written through thousands of ordinary days filled with small acts of grace, forgiveness, and trust. Stay until the very end because the biggest emotional moment is still ahead. In your soulmate discovers the one unexpected decision that fills their heart with overwhelming joy and opens the door to a hopeful new chapter. Showing that sometimes the smallest act of courage can become the beginning of the greatest blessing. My beloved child, don't skip this part. Stay until the very end because what happened after your decision touched your soulmate's heart in a way they never imagined possible. For so long, they had prayed that healing would come, not through dramatic miracles or extraordinary signs, but through quiet changes that only God could accomplish. They had stopped asking for instant answers and started asking for stronger faith. Little did they know that while they were praying for peace, God was gently transforming both of your hearts. Listen carefully, because this chapter reveals why those tears became tears of overwhelming joy. The morning began like every other morning. The sun slowly rose, birds filled the air with their songs, and people hurried through their ordinary routines without realizing that two hearts were quietly moving toward a new beginning. Your soulmate sat alone with a warm cup of coffee and opened their Bible before starting the day. Their eyes rested on words about patience, hope, and trusting God's perfect timing. They closed the book, smiled softly, and whispered, "Lord, thank you for teaching me that you are always working, even when I cannot see it. Don't skip this moment." Throughout the day, your soulmate kept remembering the change they had recently seen in you. They remembered how you chose forgiveness instead of holding on to old hurts. They remembered your gentle words where anger could have spoken. They remembered the kindness you showed to people who could offer nothing in return. These weren't grand gestures meant to impress anyone. They were quiet decisions made one day at a time, and those simple choices spoke louder than any speech ever could. As afternoon turned into evening, your soulmate found themselves walking through a quiet park where they had often gone during difficult seasons. Months earlier, that same place had witnessed tears of confusion and disappointment. They had sat on the same bench wondering whether hope still had a place in their story. But this evening felt completely different. The memories of pain were still there, yet they no longer carried the same weight. God had not erased the difficult chapters, He had redeemed them by using them to build wisdom, humility, and compassion. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. While sitting beneath the shade of an old tree, your soulmate received an unexpected message from a trusted friend. It wasn't dramatic news or a prediction about the future. It was simply an encouraging update about the positive changes they had seen in your life. They heard about your growing faith, your willingness to help others, your commitment to becoming a better person, and the peace that had begun to shine through your actions. As they read those words, they quietly lowered their head. Tears filled their eyes before they even realized they were crying. Those tears were not born from sadness. They came from gratitude. They came from realizing that the person they had been praying for wasn't standing still. You were growing. You were healing. You were becoming stronger through every challenge. They realized that God's greatest answers often arrive quietly, hidden inside ordinary acts of courage and kindness. Don't skip this part. That evening, your soulmate opened an old journal filled with prayers written over several years. One page caught their attention immediately. It read, "Lord, if you ever bring our paths together again, let it happen after you have shaped both of our hearts. Teach us to choose humility before pride, forgiveness before resentment, and faith before fear." Reading those words overwhelmed them. They could now see how faithfully God had been answering that prayer, not by changing circumstances overnight, but by changing hearts over time. The more they reflected, the more grateful they became. They remembered every season when they believed nothing was happening. They remembered the unanswered questions, the quiet disappointments, and the lonely nights that once felt endless. Looking back, every one of those seasons had become a lesson. Waiting had produced patience. Heartbreak had produced compassion. Silence had taught them how to listen more carefully to God's voice. Nothing had been wasted. Listen carefully. As darkness settled over the city, your soulmate stepped outside and looked toward the stars. With tears still in their eyes, they smiled and prayed, "Father, thank you for reminding me that real transformation begins inside the heart. Thank you for every lesson that brought us here. Whether tomorrow unfolds exactly as I imagine or not, I trust your goodness. Continue leading both of us one faithful step at a time." At that very moment, a deep peace settled over them unlike anything they had experienced before. They realized that happiness wasn't coming from certainty about the future. It came from seeing undeniable evidence of God's work in both of your lives. They finally understood that the greatest blessing wasn't simply the possibility of a renewed relationship. It was witnessing how grace had quietly transformed two ordinary people into individuals capable of loving with greater patience, wisdom, and faith. Stay until the very end because the most emotional chapter is still ahead. Your soulmate makes an unexpected decision after witnessing your growth, and one heartfelt conversation begins opening a beautiful new chapter. Filled with healing, gratitude, and hope that neither of you saw coming. My beloved child, don't skip this part. Stay until the very end, because today marks the moment your soulmate stops looking at the past with regret and begins looking toward the future with hope. For so long, they believed the story had already reached its ending. They convinced themselves that some doors close forever and that some words remain unspoken. But as they watched the quiet changes taking place in your life, they began to understand that God often works through ordinary days, gradually shaping hearts in ways we only recognize later. Listen carefully, because this chapter is about courage, gratitude, and choosing hope over fear. The morning after their heartfelt prayer, your soulmate woke with an unusual sense of peace. The familiar weight they had carried for so long was gone. They prepared for the day as usual, yet everything felt different. The same sunlight streaming through the window seemed brighter. The same morning routine felt lighter. They smiled without forcing it, realizing that peace had quietly replaced the anxiety that once greeted them every morning. Don't skip this moment. While organizing old belongings, they found a small box filled with photographs, handwritten notes, and keepsakes from different seasons of life. For a long time, they had avoided opening it because they feared it would bring back painful memories. But this time was different. Instead of sadness, each memory reminded them of how much both of you had grown. They no longer wished to relive the past. They simply felt thankful for every lesson it had provided. As they continued reflecting, your soulmate realized something that brought tears back to their eyes. The thing that made them happiest wasn't the hope of a perfect future. It was seeing that you had become someone who chose kindness even when life was difficult, someone who continued trusting God through uncertainty, and someone who allowed challenges to produce wisdom instead of bitterness. That quiet transformation filled them with gratitude because they knew genuine growth cannot be forced, it happens one faithful step at a time. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. Later that afternoon, your soulmate met with a trusted friend who had witnessed much of their journey. The friend smiled warmly and said, "I've never seen you this peaceful before." Your soulmate paused for a moment before answering, "I finally realized that my happiness doesn't depend on controlling the future. It comes from trusting God and celebrating the good work He has already done." Those words surprised even them. They were no longer speaking from fear. They were speaking from faith. That conversation encouraged your soulmate to make a decision they had postponed for far too long. They chose to stop allowing old misunderstandings to define the future. Instead, they decided that every new chapter should begin with honesty, respect, and patience. They understood that healthy relationships are not built by pretending mistakes never happened. They are built by learning from those mistakes and choosing a better way forward. Don't skip this part. That evening, they returned home and knelt in prayer once again. "Lord," they whispered, "thank you for showing me that your greatest work often happens quietly. Thank you for changing my heart before changing my circumstances. Help me continue walking with humility, compassion, and wisdom. And if you allow our paths to continue together, let our relationship reflect your love through patience, honesty, and grace." As they finished praying, they felt inspired to write a letter. Not to make dramatic promises, but simply to express gratitude. They wrote about the lessons they had learned, the forgiveness they had experienced, and the hope they now carried. Every sentence reflected sincerity. Every word came from a heart no longer burdened by fear. Whether the letter would ever be shared was not the most important thing. Writing it reminded them how much God had transformed them. Before the night ended, your soulmate stepped outside and looked up at the stars. They smiled through grateful tears and quietly said, "Thank you, Lord. The greatest gift wasn't changing my story overnight. The greatest gift was changing me." In that peaceful moment, they understood that the tears they had shed were not tears of longing anymore, they were tears of thankfulness for the healing already taking place. My beloved child, don't skip this part. Stay until the very end, because the moment your soulmate has prayed for over countless quiet nights is closer than they ever imagined. There are times when heaven seems silent, yet beneath that silence, lives are being gently transformed. While you were simply trying to become a better person, choosing kindness over bitterness, patience over frustration, and faith over fear, someone else's heart was overflowing with gratitude because of the change they could now clearly see. What happened next became one of the most emotional moments of their entire journey. Listen carefully, because every chapter before this one has been leading here. The following morning, your soulmate woke before sunrise, unable to fall back asleep. Their heart was full, not with anxiety but with anticipation. They walked quietly outside as the first rays of light touched the horizon. The cool morning air reminded them of every dawn they had once greeted with uncertainty. They remembered asking God questions they couldn't answer themselves. Why am I waiting? Why does this journey feel so long? Why does hope sometimes seem so far away? Looking back now, they smiled through grateful tears because every unanswered question had quietly become part of God's answer. Don't skip this moment. Standing beneath the open sky, your soulmate realized they were no longer asking God to change the past. They were thanking Him for using the past to prepare them for the future. Every disappointment had softened their heart. Every mistake had taught humility. Every delay had strengthened patience. Every lonely season had drawn them closer to God's presence. What once felt like broken pieces now formed a beautiful testimony of grace, growth, and unwavering faithfulness. Later that day, your soulmate met with a close friend who had witnessed nearly every step of their journey. As they shared everything that had happened, their friend smiled warmly and said, "I can hear peace in your voice now. Months ago, all I heard was fear." Your soulmate quietly laughed before answering, "Because I've finally learned that God's greatest miracles often begin inside us long before we see them around us." Those words carried a depth that only years of waiting could produce. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. That evening, while reading through old journal entries, your soulmate stopped at a page written during one of the hardest nights of their life. The words read, "Lord, if you are asking me to wait, don't let the waiting be empty. Teach me to become more patient, more compassionate, more forgiving, and more like you." Reading those lines brought tears flowing once again. They realized that every single prayer on those pages had been answered. Not always in the way they expected, but always in the way they truly needed. Those tears were tears of joy because they finally understood what had made them so emotional. It wasn't simply seeing positive changes in your life. It was realizing that both of you had been growing at the same time without even knowing it. While they were learning to release fear, you were learning to embrace forgiveness. While they were learning patience, you were discovering quiet strength. While they were surrendering their plans to God, you were learning to trust His timing. The same loving God had been writing both stories simultaneously. Don't skip this part. That realization completely changed the way your soulmate viewed your connection. They no longer saw it as a story about perfect timing or flawless circumstances. They saw it as a story about two imperfect people allowing God to shape them through ordinary days. They understood that real love isn't built on excitement alone. It grows through humility, honest conversations, mutual respect, forgiveness, and the willingness to keep choosing each other even when life becomes complicated. Don't skip this part. That realization completely changed the way your soulmate viewed your connection. They no longer saw it as a story about perfect timing or flawless circumstances. They saw it as a story about two imperfect people allowing God to shape them through ordinary days. They understood that real love isn't built on excitement alone. It grows through humility, honest conversations, mutual respect, forgiveness, and the willingness to keep choosing each other even when life becomes complicated. As night settled over the city, your soulmate knelt beside their bed one more time. This prayer sounded different from every prayer before it. Father, thank you for showing me that your timing is always worth trusting. Thank you for changing my heart before changing my circumstances. Thank you for teaching me that the greatest blessing isn't finding someone who is perfect. It's finding someone who is willing to keep growing in faith, grace, and love every single day. A deep peace filled the room. For the first time in years, there were no anxious questions, no desperate requests, and no fear about tomorrow. There was only gratitude. Gratitude for every lesson, every delay, every unexpected turn, and every quiet miracle that had prepared both hearts for this season. Your soulmate smiled, wiped away tears of happiness, and whispered softly, Lord, now I understand. You were never making me wait without purpose. You were preparing both of us for something stronger than we could have built on our own. Before drifting to sleep, they looked out the window at the stars shining brightly across the night sky. Each star reminded them of a promise that hope continues even through darkness. They realized that the greatest gift was not merely the possibility of a relationship, it was becoming the kind of person who could love with patience, humility, faith, and unwavering compassion. That realization filled their heart with a joy so deep that words could barely describe it. Stay until the very end because the final chapter is still ahead. In the conclusion of this story, the reason behind your soulmate's tears will be fully revealed, a heartfelt conversation will bring complete healing, and both of you will discover that the greatest miracle was never found in one extraordinary moment but in every ordinary day God used to quietly transform two hearts into a story filled with lasting hope, enduring faith, and unconditional love. My beloved child, don't skip these final moments. Stay until the very end because this is where every prayer, every lesson, every season of waiting, and every quiet tear finds its purpose. There were countless days when neither of you could see what God was doing. There were moments when the silence felt endless, when the future seemed uncertain, and when hope appeared distant, yet through every chapter, God was gently shaping two hearts, teaching them patience instead of panic, forgiveness instead of resentment, and faith instead of fear. Looking back, you finally realized that the greatest miracles are often the ones that happen quietly, deep within the heart, long before anyone else notices them. The morning of your next meeting arrived with an unusual sense of peace. There was no pressure to make everything perfect. There was no desire to impress one another. Both of you had reached a place where honesty mattered more than appearances and where trust mattered more than certainty. The journey had changed you. It had removed pride, softened old wounds, and replaced fear with a quiet confidence that God would continue guiding every step. Don't skip this moment. As you sat together, your soulmate smiled through grateful tears. They looked at you for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know why I cried?" they asked softly. "It wasn't because of one conversation, it wasn't because everything suddenly became easy. I cried because I finally saw the person God had been shaping you into. I watched you choose kindness when you could have chosen bitterness, that I watched you forgive when it would have been easier to hold on to hurt. I watched you keep trusting God even during difficult seasons. Those choices showed me something beautiful. They reminded me that genuine transformation is real." Those words filled the silence with warmth. You listened carefully, realizing that your own heart had been changed by the journey as well. You admitted that there were times when you almost gave up, times when you questioned whether waiting had any purpose at all. Yet every challenge had quietly taught you lessons that comfort never could. You learned patience when answers were delayed. You learned compassion through your own struggles. Most importantly, you learned to trust God one day at a time rather than demanding to see the entire path ahead. Listen carefully, because this changes everything. Your soulmate reached into their bag and placed their well-worn journal on the table. "These pages," they said, "hold years of prayers. Some were written during joyful days. Others were written through tears. But every page reminds me of one truth: God never abandoned me, even when I couldn't understand His timing." Together, you turned the pages slowly. You read prayers asking for wisdom instead of shortcuts, humility instead of pride, and the strength to become someone who could love faithfully. Every page testified to quiet growth rather than instant change. As the afternoon passed, the conversation became less about the past and more about the future. Not a future filled with unrealistic promises, but one built on simple commitments. You promised to communicate honestly, to pray before making important decisions, to forgive quickly, and to encourage one another through every season. You understood that lasting relationships are not sustained by dramatic moments alone. They grow through thousands of ordinary acts of patience, grace, and faithfulness. Don't skip this part. Before leaving, your soulmate gently took your hand and smiled. "The reason I cried with happiness," they said, "is because you finally did the one thing I had quietly prayed for. You kept growing. You didn't let disappointment make your heart hard, you allowed God to shape your character instead of giving up." Watching that transformation gave me hope. It reminded me that when we place our lives in God's hands, He can create something beautiful from seasons that once felt impossible. You smiled with grateful tears of your own. In that moment, neither of you believed your story had become perfect. Instead, you believed something even more meaningful, that whatever challenges lay ahead, you would face them with deeper faith, greater wisdom, and hearts that had been strengthened through every season of waiting. The future no longer felt frightening because you had already witnessed God's faithfulness in the past. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, both of you paused for one final prayer. Father, you whispered together, thank you for every lesson that brought us here. Thank you for every delay that taught us patience, every challenge that strengthened our faith, and every blessing that reminded us of your goodness. Help us continue walking with humility, honesty, compassion, and unwavering trust in you. A gentle peace settled over both of your hearts. It wasn't the peace of having every answer. It was the peace of knowing you didn't have to face tomorrow alone. You had learned that faith is not about controlling the future, it is about trusting God through every step of the journey. And so the story comes to its close, not with a perfect ending, but with a hopeful beginning. The tears your soulmate shed were never a sign that life had suddenly become effortless. They were tears of gratitude for the quiet work God had done in both of your hearts. The greatest gift was never simply finding each other, it was becoming people who could love with patience, humility, forgiveness, and grace. As you walked forward together, every sunrise became a reminder of new mercies, every sunset a reminder of God's faithfulness, and every ordinary day another opportunity to choose love, hope, and trust. In the end, you discovered that the most beautiful stories are not written in a single miraculous moment, but through countless faithful steps, taken one day at a time, with God leading the way.